Brodes Media.
Back where we belong, discussing the relationship problems between the quarterback and the head coach. Now, I have the entire piece printed and highlighted with a bunch of topics that I want to hit on. Before we actually get into the meat and potatoes, though, I have a few things to get off my chest. Number one, this wasn't made up. Tim McManus and Jeremy Fowler did an amazing job covering this story and laying it out in full detail, how they went from where they were last season during the downfall to where they are now with Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio, and most importantly, Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts. It was sensational from a journalism standpoint. A lot of sources involved, and it wasn't just a hit piece that had one guy as the target, and it was a clear objective to screw over Nick or to screw over Jalen. There was a lot of info and a lot of news from both sides. Some that blame Jalen, some that blame Nick, which is probably real, considering when you go through that funk, there's blame to pass around everywhere. So that's number one. Number two is it still matters. Yes, it's a different season, and we're entering 2024, but the people involved are still here. The two people we are talking about, one's the quarterback, one's the head coach. They are still here, okay? So it matters. Number three, I needed this because I was getting carried away by Jalen Hurts and his training camp on the field and how he hasn't turned the ball over, how I'm watching Elliott Shore-Parks and his training camp stats, and I'm getting all like insanely pumped up thinking about what can be. And I got sucked into the initial press conference when Nick and Jalen both got here for training camp and said the right things, and it felt genuine. And I stand by that. Those initial press conferences, since the terrible one that Jalen had a few months ago, did feel genuine. Then, the Eagles started posting a bunch of social media stuff. And maybe it wasn't just the Eagles. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe there were a lot of parties involved. Regardless, there was something off when Nick and Jalen are riding in the golf cart and everybody's snagging pictures of them smiling ear to ear. It didn't look authentic. It felt fake. It wasn't organic. And now I'm starting to wonder, did they know this ESPN article was coming out and they were getting out in front of it in the best way that they could by putting on a brave face? There's no way that Jalen goes from where he was 2 months ago to best friends with the guy. And the way that it's being perceived now with public perception due to all the giggles and the high fives and the over obnoxious love for one another is they are the bestest friends to ever walk planet Earth. It doesn't move that quickly, especially when you get into the nuts and bolts of this thing. There was a loss of respect for one another. At least that's how I read it. So I needed this. This was a wake up, Brodes. Don't forget how bad it was. Don't get too emotionally tied to not turning the rock over if you're Jalen, because there's more to it. There was a reason why I was obsessed with the story for as long as I was. There's a deep issue here. To Nick's credit, apparently he got out in front of the team and held himself accountable for it. It was emotional. It was passionate, which is no surprise. That's what he does. And he laid it out there that he is taking responsibility for how it went last year. That's step one. Do I think Jalen and Nick are in a fine spot today, currently? I think that there's a path in place for this to work, even with the awkwardness. To me, there is still an issue, and they masked the issue by putting in a middleman. Kellen Moore is the third party that is somewhat separating the two. So it's not impossible to succeed as long as Kellen Moore dips into his bag, Nick Sirianni stays the hell away, and Jalen and Kellen Moore go to work. That's how this is going to play out successfully, is if Nick stays the hell away from Jalen. But the front office and the organization essentially figured the best way to do this, if we are going to keep Nick, that's a big if. Because as the article laid out, Bill Belichick was a serious option. There was potentially a move at head coach. It was truly discussed. If we do keep Nick, though, what we have to do is separate those two so they don't bash heads. It's an interesting dynamic. Not impossible to work, but it really is less about Nick and Jalen now. Which is weird because, once again, it diminishes the head coach. So, anyway, it's not all the information being new to us. There's a lot that we did understand, but there's some very interesting wrinkles along the way. My biggest takeaway, though, was they did not respect one another. That's hard to get back. And they added a middleman to try and keep the relationship as professional as they can. But that seems odd to me that they felt the best way to do this was to separate and split up the head coach and quarterback. It's just crazy. So, in regards to Nick Sirianni, let's dive into this and what I have highlighted. And the fact that he was a passionate coach, and it came from the heart when he told the entire organization that he did not do a good enough job. His goal was to show accountability, according to a team source, and stress the need for others to do the same if the Eagles were going to correct what went wrong and move forward. Coming away from this, by the way, I just wanted to be clear that I definitely still have the same feelings that I did previously. Jalen was right to not be excited about Nick. His offense sucked, and Nick is a bigger part of the problem than anything else. Just so you understand where I'm at with some of my takes. When I hear that, though, that his goal was to show accountability and he wanted to stress the need for others to do the same if the Eagles were to correct what went wrong, I get where he's coming from, but it almost sounds to me that he stared everybody in the eyes and said, all right, listen, I was wrong. Now you better say you're wrong too. Well, does it have the same impact if that's the case? I will admit that there's a part of me that feels I could be potentially reaching a little far with that one, and I didn't want to necessarily start with that one just because I get it. Maybe that is a tiny bit of a stretch, and we should just be excited that he was willing, as the leader, to say, I was wrong. Reality is, though, he had to, or else his job was going to get taken from him. He knew he had to, or else he'd be looking for a job. And I'm not necessarily sure if he would have got picked up off the street to go be hired by any other franchise if the Eagles did move on from him. So part of me wonders how much of that was just to save his job. And once the entire team recognizes the only reason he's here is because he has no more power anymore, there's only one way to go about this, is admit that he was wrong and now he's going to adapt to a different style. But hey, if I was wrong, you better say that you were wrong too. That's sort of what I felt. One source with direct knowledge of the dynamic described the relationship as fractured, okay, and unhealthy. Okay. At the root of the divide, a disconnect in the offensive visions, with what a team source described as a lack of full respect of Sirianni's X's and O's chops. Yeah, I saw it too. He stinks when it comes to scheme. He wouldn't allow Brian Johnson and Jalen Hurts to elevate the offense and take it to the next step. And apparently, it was because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But Nick, what you're forgetting here is this is the National Football League. If you don't adapt and make any changes and add some sexiness and differences to your offense and add another layer to it, you will get caught up on. They sniffed this out like nothing. There was apparently a time where players didn't know when Nick was stepping in and calling plays or if it was Brian Johnson. I told you Brian Johnson was not as bad as the ridiculing was. We have zero knowledge on who Brian Johnson is. Zero. Apparently, Jalen and Johnson wanted to evolve the system and, quote, that did not fly for Nick. And in Washington, when they played the Commanders, or that game might have been here, I forget, week 4 against the Commanders, on a critical 3rd and long play, this is just one of the examples of many, Brian Johnson wanted to pass, and Nick Sirianni dialed up a run, which did not pan out. The line was blurred enough that some offensive players did not know who was actually calling the plays. Come on, dude. Come on! I don't understand.